Hello and welcome to our special episode of God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm music critic and Nexus 6 in his original packaging, Giles Goff.
And I'm source maker and basic pleasure model, Phil Coleman.
And for the 40th anniversary of its original release, we'll be looking at Bladerunner. Phil, what did you think the first time you watched this film?
It's been a long time since I first watched this film, but I'll always remember just feeling like I'd watched something that was completely, I don't know how to put this really into words, like you just can't replicate what Blade Runner does for modern cinema. It was just so ahead of its time, such a homage to the kind of films that we'd had in the previous with its film noir sort of like setting as well, and the way it told its story. So it felt familiar, but it also felt so far into the future. And I'll never forget the first time I watched it. I just was open-mouthed, like, wow, I can't believe I've had the opportunity to watch this film. This is... Well, I've just watched Blade Runner. I mean, what more can you say? You know, it was amazing.
Do you know what? I was a bit screwed on that first time I watched it because somebody said to me, this is the best sci-fi film ever. Now that's... Some might say that is setting some unrealistically high expectations for a person going into a film. Do you know what I mean? It's amazing, but if you tell somebody going into it, this is the best film ever, their expectations are going to be like through the roof, and kind of whatever comes through is going to be a bit disappointing. Do you know what I mean? I
can imagine as a viewer as well, you'd be like, but what if I don't like it? You know, like
what does that say about me as a person?
Does that mean I suck at watching films? Like, you know, am I doing something wrong?
Basically, Blade Runner is like the Hamlet of film texts. You know, it's kind of dull to watch if you're going in cold, but if you're studying it, flipping it, you can get absolutely miles and miles of stuff out of it.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack from that film. It's so multi-layered as stories go in terms of like analysis as well. It's such a great film, such a good film.
Definitely. All right, now it's time for Phil's Facts.
Remember to breathe, please. Thank you. Yeah, so
I'm a Nexus 6. I don't need to breathe. It's all good.
All right, yeah, but you do only have a few years. Let's start off with the obvious. Blade Runner is a 1982 science fiction film directed by Ridley Scott, starring Harrison Ford, Rutger Hauer, Sean Young, and Edward James Olmos. It is an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The film is set in a dystopian future Los Angeles of 2019 in which synthetic humans known as replicants are bioengineered by the powerful Tyrell Corporation to work on space colonies, and when a fugitive group of advanced replicants, led by Roy Batty, played by Hauer, escapes back to Earth, burnt-out cop Rick Deckard reluctantly agrees to hunt them down, played by Harrison Ford. So, fact one, director Sir Ridley Scott there, and you have to use the Sir, obviously, because, you know, he's after a bit, like, if you don't use the Sir, like, he just doesn't invite you to his parties anymore, and, like...
See... In my head, I call him Sir Ridder, you know, or just Ridder, you know, for street friends.
It's just Rids with a Z.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like that's what we call him on the street, at least. Anyway, especially in Warrington. You know what it is. So anyway, him and director of photography Jordan Cronenweth achieved the famous shining eyes effect, as in what would for viewers at home, what would denote if you are a replicant, you would have shiny eyes, by using a technique invented by Fritz Lang of Metropolis fame, known as
boy Fritz.
Our boy Fritz, mate.
Wow.
I can't really make that into more streaks. It already ends in a Z, so you know. It's a process known as the Schuften process. Where light is bounced into the actors and actresses' eyes off a piece of half-mirrored glass mounted at a 45-degree angle to the camera.
That is proper old-school practical. I love that. That's wicked.
What gets me as well is like the technology existed there as well to be able to do it sort of like as a special effect. Like it wasn't uncommon to have like, you know, augmented lighting effects in a film, but the fact that he did it that way is just so natural and so timeless. I think that's great. Yeah,
definitely.
I absolutely love that. According to Rutger Hauer's biography, the final confrontation between Rick Deckard and Roy Batty was to have been fought in an old gym, and apparently was going to be using martial arts such as kung fu or something similar. Hauer disliked the idea, saying it was a little bit too Bruce Lee, and he also didn't know kung fu anyway, so it's kind of a non-starter, you know?
Yeah. It's a bit like, and now, guys, this last scene is going to take place on horseback. You're like, okay, it's a bit John Wayne-y, and also I can't ride a horse.
Yeah, I've never
It's that
ridden.
kind of
I've
vibe.
just never ridden a horse. You know what I mean? I just don't know what to tell you, Mr. Scott. And Howard claims to have come up with the idea of Batty chasing Deckard through that dilapidated flats. Oh, it's where
It's the place that belongs to J.F. Sebastian.
that's it. Yeah, it's the place where he's got all them little replicant toys and such in it,
Yeah, that's the one.
which felt very AI to me. For
As in,
Spielberg.
Spielberg, yeah, with the
Yeah,
Haley
yeah.
Joel Osment and Jude Law in. Yeah,
That's the
well,
one.
see, thing is, the J.F. Sebastian with the little sort of toys, that is like a microcosm of the story as a whole. You know, the fact that
Yeah.
somebody is effectively building people to entertain him, to keep him company,
Yeah.
is a bit like human beings and Tyrell Corporation building robots to be all manner of things, including basic pleasure models, you know?
Yeah, you can see like a creative parallel there for
Yeah,
certain.
definitely.
You know. So a female gymnast was hired as a stunt double for Daryl Hannah in the scene where Pris attacks Rick Deckard. But director Sir Ridley Scott rehearsed the scene so many times that when they were ready to actually shoot the scene, she was knackered. She couldn't do anything. So the scene was actually filmed with a male gymnast that they've been able to track down during the lunch break. Well,
just track down a male gymnast during lunch break.
this sort of begs many questions. Where were you filming? Was there an overabundance of gymnasts? Did they have to be male, or was he just the one that was free? You know, like I don't know. It's
It's a bit like how in Flashdance for the big sort of finale scene, they got a male breakdancer called Crazy Legs to sort of stick on a wig and then perform the spinning round thing. That's brilliant.
Do you know, if I was in the career that would be dance, I would really hope to be called Crazy Legs. That's something to aspire to, right?
That's the dream.
And last one from me today. Originally, the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was set in 1992, although later editions brought the date forward to 2021. The filmmakers initially identified the date as 2020, but settled on 2019 because 2020 sounded too much like the common term for perfect vision, 20/20.
Yeah, 2020 vision.
Just a shame at how 2020 actually bloody well turned out, but there we go. You know what I mean?
Awesome. Thank you for those Phil's facts. They were brilliant. And I'll tell you something.
No
like
worries,
I say,
no
I
worries.
did an essay on Blade Runner, Fight Club, and postmodernism. So there was a point where I knew flipping everything about this film and all the things around it. And the fact that you managed to find me some trivia that I didn't know already is really quite impressive. So give yourself a pat on the back for that one. Our next guest is a walking trivia machine and was an absolute joy to speak to. Before we start, I just want to apologise for the audio quality on this one, guys. It's not quite up to our usual standards, which is why it sounds like I'm conducting the interview from the bottom of a well. I'll let him introduce himself.
Oh, hi, my name is Andy Godfrey, and for the last 36 years I've been in full-time Christian work, working primarily as an evangelist with different organisations. I've also pastored 2 churches, and I spent 10 years travelling to Eastern Europe lecturing in Bible schools on evangelism. But outside of that, I'm something of a movie obsessive. I'm sitting in a room at the moment that has got 3,000 movies in it on Blu-ray and DVD. The walls of my home are wall-to-wall posters from movies, and my best friend tells me this is why I live on my own. So you can see my life gets quite full, and I just enjoy being around the cinema and watching movies. And it's great because I'm able to combine my faith with my passion for movies, because I write for 2 Christian publications. So I write for Sorted magazine, which is the UK's leading Christian magazine for men. You can get it in some branches of WH Smith's. You can get it online. I also write for the Good News newspaper, which is an evangelistic newspaper aimed entirely at people who don't believe in God. It's a newspaper for people who have no faith, for people who say God doesn't exist. So that's really good as well. So I get to combine my passion for movies and my passion for Jesus in those 2 areas by writing about films for Christian publication.
Andy, we are really grateful to have you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's get straight to it. how did Blade Runner come about?
Well, if you remember back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a whole slew of science fiction films. We had Superman, we had Star Wars, and studios were looking for properties that were set either in outer space or had a science fiction element to them. The studio that produced Blade Runner, somebody had, a long time before this, sent in a script based on a novel by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This is a story of a detective in the near future. In fact, it's a post-apocalyptic future. There's been a world war. Some androids have starting to run amok. They've gone a bit wild. They're starting to kill people. The book is very, very violent. The book is even more violent than the film. A script had been written based on this book by Philip K. Dick, and Ridley Scott, who of course was a very hot property at the time because he just released Alien to incredible acclaim. I mean, Alien had been one of the biggest blockbusters of recent years. So Ridley Scott got hold of this script, read it, thought he could do something with it, got hold of a couple of screenwriters. They changed a few things from the novel, decided to give it a go because of the popularity of science fiction films at that particular time. Now, the most notable difference, Giles, between the novel and the film is the absence of the term Blade Runner. You won't find the term Blade Runner in the novel. The movie was actually inspired by the name of a 1979 novella by William S. Burroughs, where he talks about, where he describes bounty hunters as Blade Runners. So it's actually, although everybody says Blade Runner is based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, actually there's a lot of William S. Burroughs in there. Also, the word replicant, which is used in the film to describe these androids that have gone amok, is in neither book. In fact, in Philip K. Dick's book, they're called Andys, not A-N-D-Y, A-N-D-I. So that's another major shift from the book to the film. They had to obviously make it a little bit more dramatic. The book is very violent, but it has some very long descriptive passages. It's a little bit slow, hard going in places, I find, the novel. Very typical of Philip K. Dick's sort of surreal work, where he goes off at great tangents. So the story had to be honed down a little bit. But this is why really it came about, because Ridley Scott was looking for a follow-up to Alien, and studios like Warner Brothers were looking for science fiction properties because that was a big thing at the time. So then they got around to casting it, of course, and famously Harrison Ford, who was perhaps the biggest name in Hollywood at the time, was cast as Deckard, the detective sent out to get these rogue replicants, as they're called in the film. Harrison Ford has been so reluctant to talk about this film. He did not like it. He did not have a good time filming it. He didn't enjoy being on rain-soaked sets for day after day. And this is Indiana Jones, remember. This is Han Solo. And he particularly didn't like the fact that he was asked to record a narration. You know, it was a dark, rainy night in the city and I was on my way home. And Ford hated it. And he wouldn't talk about the film for years. In fact, he didn't talk. The film came out in 1982. For 10 years, Harrison Ford stayed silent. He wouldn't do any publicity for the film. He wouldn't go out on junkets to advertise it. He eventually did speak about it in 1992. Talked about the frequent disputes that he'd had with Ridley Scott, the fact that he didn't like the voiceovers and so on. But he has now come round, and in recent years, again, he started to talk about the film as well, to a much more positive image of a much more positive representation of the film. He actually now will talk about it if you press him. And the script had been bouncing around for a while, but I think it had been deemed unfilmable because simply the special effects did not exist to bring Philip K. Dick's work to life. And now, of course, with the advent of Star Wars, it was all about special. Even James Bond, even the Bond people delayed making For Your Eyes Only and made Moonraker instead, which they set in outer space because of the influence of Star Wars. So everybody was wanting to be in outer space.
So obviously, quite famously, Blade Runner has an original cut and a director's cut and a final cut. So from what I remember, it's one of the first films I know that had a director's cut. So why was there a director's cut? and how is it different from the original version?
So Ridley Scott likes his director's cuts. You may know that he released a director's cut of Alien. The interesting thing about both the director's cut of Alien and the director's cut of Blade Runner is that they are both shorter than the original film. You think he's going to be adding to it, but they're actually just a couple of minutes shorter. So when Ridley Scott made the director's cut, he took the decision to take out the narration. It doesn't need a narration. It doesn't need the plot being explained to the audience. The audience are intelligent enough to work out what's going on their own. The second thing that Ridley Scott did with the director's cut was he changed the rather happy, soapy ending to the film. So in the first film, Harrison Ford has fallen in love with a girl called Rachel, but we see the two of them flying off together into the sunset through out of the dense city they've been living in into a beautifully wooded, forested area. And in fact, those shots that you see in the original film of them flying away through forests and trees and alongside mountains, they were actually taken from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Those are actually the original shots that Kubrick used for the opening of The Shining. Scott just borrowed them, basically. And the other thing is, there was always a question mark in the first film as to whether Deckard himself was a replicant. Was Harrison Ford a replicant? In the director's cut, it is made much more clear that Ford may well be a replicant. There are more sort of hints added into the script that Ford is a replicant. So the Blade Runner was 1982. The director's cut was 10 years later. And then in 2007, Ridley Scott released the final cut. And this runs exactly the same length as the original, 1 hour, 57 minutes. But it doesn't have the happy ending. It doesn't have the narration. There are more special effects have been added. There were just added scenes of the city. There were more special effects. And the special effects that looked a bit dodgy in 1982 now have been cleaned up to look perfect. So my favourite version is actually the final cut. But I could quite happily sit and watch all three, because all three are entertaining science fiction movies. A bit hard-hitting. As I say, they're a little bit violent, but they also have this amazing theme running through them. And all they want is more life. And Rutger Hauer, at the end of the film, as he's dying, makes this incredible speech about what he's seen. And he talks about tears in the rain. And it's a script, part of the script he wrote himself. He looked at what had been written, wasn't happy with it, and went away and rewrote it. And it's just the most beautiful scene at the end. This guy who's been so violent, this guy who has been so, suddenly actually takes on a degree of humanity, and you end up feeling sorry for him. And you wish he could live longer because you could see his potential. But there he is. And in the original narration, the character played by Harrison Ford says, "I don't know why he saved my life, but I did see something in him that spoke of the value of life." So my favourite is the director's cut, is the final cut, but I will quite happily sit and watch all three.
That is absolutely some of the most comprehensive answers I have ever heard to any questions I've ever asked. Andy, thank you so much for spending time talking to us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime, Giles, and any film.
So, Phil, that was Andy Godfrey. What do you think?
Well, man nearly put me out of a job. I was, it was really good fun to listen to someone who's just so passionate about something like that. Like a lot of our guests that we've had, basically you just sit and listen when people like that talk. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You're going to be much more likely to learn something if you just sit there and just go, "Hey, man, you just do your thing." And you know what? I would be fine with doing that in person or in an interview setting any day with that guy. I thought he was fascinating.
Yeah, he was great. He's the film editor for Sorted magazine, and he's got a really kind of sort of down-to-earth vibe in the way he writes that kind of totally hides the fact that he's an absolute walking font of knowledge when it comes to cinema. And it was like, oh, well, this is an interesting vision of the future for Giles, you know? And it's like I could see myself turning into worse things. Do you know what I mean?
No, I think turning into someone like that, you could do worse, couldn't you?
Yeah. So just before we get on to finding the faith in the film, I just wanted to talk about what I'm calling Deckard in the Me Too era. Now, it's probably worth noting before we get started that not all the gender politics necessarily stands up to modern scrutiny. I don't know if you remember, there's a scene where Deckard forces a kiss on Rachel, and
Yes.
whether she likes it towards the end, she certainly doesn't seem to be... It's definitely not enthusiastic consent, is it?
Not as much as it could have been.
Not that enthusiastic. So I think the implication is that he thinks if she's just a machine, then perhaps he can do what he wants to her. And he's very slowly figuring out that that's not okay. So I think the general takeaway from this is to treat everyone, man, woman, or machine, with basic respect. Not necessarily for their sake, but for what it says about you as a person.
Yeah.
Also, and this is a long shot, but it might just help prevent the machine uprising, which would be nice, you know?
I've got a lot of things on. And, the machine uprising is honestly just going to set me back at least a few days. Great.
You would not believe how much a nuclear apocalypse really messes up my deadlines, you know? Now it's time for... Finding the faith in the film.
It's getting harder and harder to come up with different ways of doing that.
Just a sense of defeat in that.
Oh goodness!
Awesome.
I did an exam today, so I'm burnt out today. So I'm doing my best.
Okay, so for the purposes of this episode, we're going to be talking about Blade Runner and its sequel, Blade Runner 2049. Simply for being contrary, I'm going to start at the end and just have a quick chat about Blade Runner 2049. There's some fascinating stuff to say about that film, but not too much in terms of faith parallels that at least I could see. The central crux of that film is about the birth of a child to a replicant, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's the birth of a child heralds the freedom for an oppressed people. So basically, we're talking about a messiah figure coming, that will sort of effectively lead the replicants out of slavery. And we've talked in the past about how even secular filmmakers can't get away from the story of Jesus and the concept that it's almost like the story's like hardwired in there. Do you know what I mean?
It's quite societally ingrained, I think, in the public consciousness.
Definitely. And then there's a brilliant bit that Kay or Joe, Ryan Gosling's character, says when he's talking to his boss. He says something like, if something is born, it has a soul, which I thought was like a really... just an absolutely beautiful... It's a beautiful line in and of itself. And then you think, well, why would Kay have been told that in the first place? And I thought, well, that's clearly must have been used as a form of, like, oppression. We have souls, so therefore we are entitled to more rights than you are. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a sweeping statement that's used for control, like that's... Yeah. Because it's not necessarily... It's a great line, but it doesn't necessarily...
Yeah.
mean it's true.
And the way he kind of delivers it with such innocence, and the way he kind of uses it as a rebuff to sort of killing the child of Rachel is, I just find that fascinating. In my heart of hearts, and I'm sure the film geek community will come for me, but in my heart of hearts, Blade Runner 2049 is the superior film out of the two. I really like Villeneuve. I really like the way he reuses rain. I think the payoffs in some areas are stronger, and the emotional beats are hit better. But then again, you can't... How can I put it? You can't disentangle the two. Part of the reason why Blade Runner 2049 is so good is because of all the knowledge you've got built in from Blade Runner. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. I feel like 2049 is possibly the better constructed piece of filmmaking, but the amount that the original informs it's just hard to discount it completely. You've got to have seen the other one. You've got to have understood the other one, and to be deeply sort of ingrained in the lore of the other one as well. And I can agree with that. I can agree that 2049 was a better crafted piece of filmmaking, but the significance of the first one is it just can't be denied, basically.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about the Fires of Orc line that Roy uses. When Roy and Leon arrive at the eye lab run by Hannibal Chew, the little fella that kind of makes the eyes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. It always freaked me out, that scene.
Yeah, quite right too.
Just some eyes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not great.
So Roy says, "Fire of the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc." Have you any idea where that comes from?
I mean, considering the title of our podcast, no, but I could make an educated guess.
Well, I thought it was a quote from Paradise Lost by John Milton, but it's actually from British poet and visionary William Blake. Have you ever heard of Blake? He was an artist. He was Christian. He was an artist. He was a poet. He's the one that came up with Tiger, tiger, burning bright through the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame my fearful symmetry? Now, Blake was either totally off with the fairies, or he was playing like 12-dimensional chess. You know, and those two things look pretty much the same. Do you know what I mean?
6 of one, half dozen of the other, right? At that point.
Exactly, yeah. So he wrote these kind of books of sort of like prophecy, but they're not really prophecies in the Nostradamus sense of the word. They're more like allegories, you know. And obviously, these allegories that he's writing are heavily influenced by Paradise Lost, which is heavily influenced by the Bible, and he's influenced by the Bible, and so on and so forth, you know? So, believe it or not, that line that Roy says is actually a misquote. Apparently, it's fire of the angels, rise, deep thunder, rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc. So, Blake created a mythology that was a blend of allegory and prophecy. Now, the character, Orc, is the actual name of a character that represents rebellion. You know, he's meant to be like the spirit of rebellion.
Yeah.
So in that line, what Batty is doing, he's identifying himself as a rebel and an angel. So who does that lead us to?
That sounds sort of like Lucifer.
Do you know what? I flip and love you sometimes.
Do you know what I mean?
Not only because you got the right person, but also you got the right name. Do you know what Lucifer means?
Doesn't it mean like I don't think it's the fallen one. No, I think it's the alternative. No, the alternative is that's Satan. Yeah.
So Satan means the accuser. It could be used in a court of law, sort of thing. Ha-Satan, you know. But this Lucifer means morning star. If you think about it, a star that you could see in the morning after dawn means a star that shines brighter than all the other stars. Yeah. So how much do you know about Lucifer's origin story, for want of a better phrase?
I know that I say I know this, like, from what I think I know, is that he made a bid for God's, like, sort of, like, position, as it were. Either way, he did something that really naffed God off, and then God just went, right, off with you, sling your hook, and then just chucks him out of heaven, and Lucifer was like, fine, I'm going to go to Mustafar. So, and that, my friends, is the story of Revenge of the Sith.
That's pretty much it, Mustafar aside. So biblical references to this are a bit scant. So what is largely believed is that Satan fell from heaven, or got kicked out of heaven, because of his pride. So he was an archangel. He was exceedingly beautiful and wonderful and the rest of it. This gets covered in like Isaiah 14:12 and Ezekiel 28. That's in those passages. They're referring to a bloke called the King of Tyre, which also could be referring not only to the guy, an actual man, but also to the spirit behind him, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So Satan is the highest of all angels, the anointed cherub, the most beautiful of all God's creations, but he's not happy where he is. Instead, Satan desires to be God, to essentially kick God off his throne and take over and rule the universe.
And this is naturally.
Yeah, I mean, we've
all been there,
you know. So the quote from Isaiah 14, verse 12 is, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, yet you who weakened the nations," you know? So right from the start there, we've got a sort of like Roy as Satan kind of thing going on. Do you know what I mean? Or Roy as Lucifer sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to, and I've just watched it again just recently, when the replicants, when Roy gets to ask Tyrell for more life, you know?
Oh, yeah,
when
of course.
He sort of goes into his bedroom.
It's really tragic, like, because you can see the desperation that Roy's got, but you can also see sort of almost like the horror that Tyrell sees. He's like, oh my God, what have I actually created?
Well, the thing is, Tyrell doesn't see it until the end. Tyrell is incredibly proud of him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and they have this little bit about, well, what about this? And we're like, yeah, we found that there's cellular degeneration at this point. And so I feel like Tyrell would have given him more life if he could have done. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but it just simply was not able
was
to
not
be
an
done.
option. Yeah, definitely. So this is a bit of a weird take, but I think of Tyrell as like an atheist's idea of God. He's kind of all powerful, but cruel and arbitrary to an extent, you know? More specifically, I think of him as Nietzsche's idea of God, Friedrich Nietzsche. There's this quote where it says, God is dead. God remains dead and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mighty of all of us that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off for us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festival of atonement, what sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?
It's heavy going. You know what I mean?
It's pretty intense, Nietzsche.
I know I'm an atheist, but that's like for just for mainly for reasons of logic. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
crime is like man needs a beer.
Yeah, it is pretty full on. So that is from 1882, Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Which is sometimes translated. It's sometimes translated as the joyful pursuit of knowledge and understanding, or the gay science. It doesn't sound that joyful. Do you know what I mean?
Not really. It sounds, well, it just sounds like the opposite. In fact, it sounds really bloody depressing. And so, again, I'm an atheist. You know what I mean? Like,
so there we have this idea of sort of Tyrell as God and the replicants as angels, which is something that is underscored even further in Blade Runner 2049 when Jared Leto's character Wallace refers to them as his angels, you know? So we're constantly made to think of these characters as being like angels.
Sort of more on the nose with the second one, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Now, this one might be a bit intense. I might be stretching it a little bit here. I might cut this out. We'll see how we go, you know?
All right.
But I wanted to talk about the idea of Deckard's suspicion that he's a replicant, okay?
Yes. The age-old discussion since it came out.
Well, beyond that, it's not just whether he is a replicant or not. It's whether he suspects he is in the film. That's what I'm interested in.
That's what you're saying,
Now, it's possible I'm projecting this onto Deckard rather than actually being there, but I think Deckard may be suspecting that he's a replicant throughout this film. Obviously, we see in the director's cut the daydream of the unicorn, and Rachel asks him if he's ever taken the Voight-Kampff test himself, which is obviously what you test to see if somebody's human or a replicant or not. So they're feeding the idea into us quite early on, you know?
Yeah.
And all that is arguably confirmed by Gaff, played by Edward James Olmos' character, leaves him the origami unicorn. You know, it's a little way of saying, I know what's in your head. You've been thinking about unicorns. How could I know if you're thinking about unicorns? It's because all your memories are on a file somewhere, just like Deckard does with Rachel. So I think for a person to question their identity means to question their place in this world and also the nature of the world itself. And this made me think of what it must be like to go from being like a straight up, out and out atheist to becoming a Christian. Now, I couldn't relate to this very easily because whilst I decided for myself to follow Jesus at 14, I'd always believed in him as a result of my upbringing. So, this leads me to one question. Phil, who's your favourite Greek philosopher?
Yeah.
Bit of a curveball for you.
I get that. I get asked this all the time. So, no, I don't know.
Now, obviously, Aristotle is my boy because he wrote down Poetics, which was the first rules for drama. But today, we're going to look at Plato's thought experiment called The Cave. Have you ever heard of this one?
I have heard of this, actually, yeah. We have talked about this. It was at the Matrix episode. Because we're talking
Might be Natalie talked about it.
Natalie talked about it.
Yeah.
I remember now.
Yeah. So, in this allegory, there's a cave. And there's a group of people who have lived their lives chained to the wall of the cave. And they've been there all their lives. And they are facing a blank wall. Now, the mouth of the cave is behind them. And they can see shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire or from the light behind them. And they give names to these shadows. The shadows are essentially the prisoner's reality. But they are not completely accurate representations of the real world. So the shadows represent the fragments of reality that we can normally perceive through our senses, while the objects under the sun represent the true forms of objects that we can only perceive through reason. So Plato talks about how the philosopher is like a prisoner who is freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall are actually not the direct source of the images seen. And he suggests that like a philosopher aims to understand and perceive the higher levels of reality. However, the other inmates of the cave do not even want to leave their prison because they don't know anything better. You with me?
Yeah, I mean, if it's all you knew. It's like when people don't leave Warrington. I'm just like, oh my sweet summer child. There's a whole world out there, you know? Like, just... You don't have to drink John Smith's. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, now, this might be a stretch, but for me, I thought Plato's cave could be compared to a replicant realizing they're a replicant, and their memories have been given to them as a form of control. So, if you found out all the memories you have, the things you take comfort in, the things you're proud of, the things you're ashamed of, weren't real, they're almost like the shackles that have been holding you in place. Arguably, you'd be able to live a life free of all the hang-ups and stuff that has just held you back that have come from those memories.
Arguably, yeah, because if they were fictional, or at the very least not your own.
Yeah. I think it also works for the idea of a non-believer coming to believe in God, you know? So there's the realization that you're part of a wider story and a much more complex narrative. And the idea that the being that created the cosmos also created you, and he did so for a purpose, must be like seeing those shapes directly for the first time when all you've seen are the shadows of the wall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, you know, your reality was... your reality was fictitious because all you saw was those shadows, all you saw was the wall. Yeah. And then in your sort of like interpretation of this, like that's the same as like God is not real, and everything you know of God not being real is the fictitious part.
Yeah, but it's also worth pointing out that the cave allegory can also work the other way. So you could apply it to a person's journey from any faith to non-belief. I've been sort of looking into a lot of stuff about the FLDS at the moment, the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, like the sort of extreme Mormons, and heard it sort of applied in that area.
Bit of light
and
reading,
even
then,
just for the fun, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you could apply it to sort of ex-Mormon friends who would also sort of see that cave allegory.
Of course,
do you know what I mean?
Of course. I mean, having spoken to, you know, ex-Mormon people, that, you can see the difference that they feel when they sort of are no longer part of that community, and they say, hang on a minute, this wasn't the way that everyone else sees things. This is... Yeah, exactly. And this is quite alarming.
Yeah, very much so. The last thing I want to talk about is Roy Batty's last act. When Roy knows he only has minutes left to live, he does an absolute 180 and goes from trying to kill Deckard to trying to save him. I don't suppose you can remember any of his lines.
What, the speech at the end?
Yeah, the speech at the end.
I actually know the whole thing, as far as I'm aware.
Go for it.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I've watched sea beams glitter at the entrance to the Tannhauser Gate. All of these moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die.
Flipping Rutger Hauer wrote that himself, you know. Like that is his own stuff that he came up with. That is insane.
When we lost Rutger Hauer, we lost such a beautiful wealth of knowledge and experience.
I know, right?
What a bloody guy. I'll never... There's a reason I know that off by heart, because although I think I got one or two words wrong, but...
You're not flipping far off. If you did get anything wrong, I didn't notice it. I was doing a church announcement recently, and I was up at the stage, up on the front talking, and sometimes my friend John and I, we will just put things in there to entertain each other, you know, and completely ignore everybody else.
Yeah.
So I was talking about like a project where we're talking about like recording people's memories, and I said, because if we don't record them, they'll be lost like tears in rain. And the problem was John wasn't in the room at the time, so I just get this sea of silence coming back at me. It's
I tell you what, I bet there was someone there just like, bloody hell, he wrote that himself. That's I've never heard anything so wonderful in all my life. I'm a changed man or woman.
Yeah.
Or dog.
That's definitely what.
Maybe it was a dog that listened and was just like, oh my God, woof, you know?
Anyway, let's get back to it. So Batty goes from trying to kill Deckard to saving him. So why does he do this? This dude has been trying to execute him, retire him. For all Roy knows, he'll keep on killing his kind after Roy has died. And it got me thinking that Roy Batty's last act in the world is an act of mercy. And this reminded me so much, and it might be fresh in my mind because we did Passion of Christ last time, was that one of the last things that Jesus does is he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. That's Luke 23, verse 34. And it was just that thought of showing mercy and compassion for your executors, for your executioners.
Yeah, I think so. But also, I feel as though, from a different perspective, I feel as though Roy Batty in that moment it's more human of him to show mercy to Deckard than it is for him to let him fall and die. And the thing that he wants most of all is to be truly human and to have a long lifespan and to live a life of his own. And I think that's completely in line with his character development at that point. He's not looking he's looking for justice for himself, but it would be completely unjust for him to let Deckard die just because he was angry.
Yeah.
So,
do you know what? I couldn't agree with you more. And personally, I think the film agrees with you because it's not technically the last thing he does. The last thing he does is let go of the dove that's in his arms, isn't it?
Technically, yeah.
What does a dove represent? Well, doves represent peace. They represent the Holy Spirit. There's that bit in Matthew 3:16 when Jesus is being baptized, and the line is, at that moment heaven opened and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on Jesus,
Yeah.
But a dove more often has been used to represent the human soul. I couldn't find the origin of that belief, but that's one of the things it has. So I think this scene, the dove taking flight, kind of implies Roy's soul leaving his body, and it's just beautiful.
It's perfect. It's perfect in terms of a visual motif to represent that. It's just simple and beautiful, and yeah, it's a genius piece of work there from our Ridders.
Ridders.
Good. Great bunch of lads.
Awesome.
Great bunch of lads.
A great bunch of lads, definitely. Okay, ladies and gents, that wraps up our Finding the Faith in the Film section. We have some reviews. I won't go through all of them. I know, right? Yeah. We have one review that said that we were perfectly formed. And that is, she said, so this is from KP over Apple Podcasts, who says, great hosts, fascinating insights, and engaging guest speakers, all crammed into the perfect length to accompany me on a quick walk or entertain me for about half of my lunch hour. This is from KP, who I'm pretty sure is Kate Parker. I mean, considering our episodes are about 45 minutes long, flipping, how long is Kate getting for her lunch hour? That's what I want to know.
I mean, I wouldn't mind that, but also, how long is your long walks?
I know, right?
Like, if a quick walk's 45 minutes, there's a long walk like 3 hours. Then
thank you, KP. We think you're pretty great too. So that's all for now, ladies and gents. If you have been, thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out our sister show, the Media Mag Podcast, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and the Book of Face. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at _GilesGoff or at BiffyB, BIFFI, capital B for Phil.
That's me.
That's everything. Phil, have you had a good time?
Well, Blade Runner will always be one of my favourite films that I've ever seen. So yes, I got to do the Tears in Rain speech on the podcast. So yeah, no, I'm absolutely fine, man. That's great.
Yeah, mate, you absolutely smashed that. Awesome. Thank you for listening, guys. See you next time for our upcoming series on horror.
Woo!
Bye. God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff and
Phil Coleman.
Mixing by Phil, editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
God in Film is a Dask production. Please rate and review, unless it's a 1-star, in which case, please drop off your handwritten review at one of our offices on the off-world colonies. And provided you pass the Voight-Kampff test, we'll take your thoughts into consideration.